my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I have another spoiler-free book review to share with you guys. I think this is the third one in the past week. Since January started, I've been getting a ton of reading done. Towards the end of December, I had been in a bit of a reading slump, but that is over, and we are full speed ahead. So today we're going to be talking about The Trees Grew Because I Bled There by LaRocca. First of all, that title. That's the kind of title that you hear about and you kick yourself for not thinking of it first. So good. This is a collection of short stories. This is the second collection of his that I've read. The first one I was lucky enough to get an early copy of, I think at the end of the summer, and that was called Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes, which is also a great title. Eric's clearly very gifted at coming up with titles. Not just that, of course, he's a gifted writer as well, but so let's just get on into it. This video is going to be fairly short because since it's a collection of short stories, it's hard to say too much about each story without getting into any kind of spoiler territory. So I'm just going to talk about the collection in general, and then I've got some thoughts I want to share with you about reading horror as an adult in general that this book kind of made me think about, but I'll save that till the end. In case you're here for the review, we're just gonna get right to it. So, The Trees Grew Because I Bled There. I'm not entirely sure exactly how many stories are in there. I think maybe like 7 or 8. There's a good few. In the first collection it was, I think, 3. So this had a few more. Some were really short, some were a little longer. And this whole collection, first of all, let me start off by saying I loved this one more than the last. The last one I gave 4 stars to. On Goodreads, this one's getting 5. Loved it so much. All of the stories in this collection kind of share a similar umbrella type of theme, I guess you would say, in that they all are related to relationships of some sort, or family of some sort. And I liked that. I liked that way it looked at different facets of families and relationships. Now, this collection is not going to be for everyone. There were parts that I found very uncomfortable to read because I guess the best way to word it would be that Eric writes, he's a very bold author who's not afraid to sort of dive headfirst into situations and storylines that perhaps others might shy away from. And I love that about it. I love that about him. The stories, there are some that will be more controversial than others. The last one I'm thinking will definitely raise a few eyebrows. But in general, I loved this collection because for me, despite some of the more controversial, I don't know how it's to word it, subject matters, the way that Eric writes is so tonally beautiful, and there were so many lines I would read and I just go back and read them again and again because they were so beautiful. He's describing horrific things, but he's describing it so beautifully that you just can't help but fall in love with Eric as a storyteller. And I found that with the first collection too that I read, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, and some things in that collection also made me very, very uncomfortable, especially in the title story. But despite that, as soon as I saw this current one up for grabs on NetGalley, I jumped at it because I knew I would feel similar things. I knew it, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to see what other stories he had rattling around in his brain, and I do not regret it one bit. My favorite story, I think, was the one titled You're Not Supposed to Be Here. And it kind of falls right in the middle of the book, I think, or somewhere about in there. And I thought, like, that one really kept me on my toes. There's a bit of thriller element to it, but also just really gruesome and dread-inducing, and I loved it. Yeah, I think that would be my favorite, but I liked them all. I don't think there's one that I can really point out that I didn't love. like as the least favorite, they were all held up pretty good, even though there were two we'll say one where I kind of had to skim a few parts because I didn't know where it was going, and it was making me feel like viscerally uncomfortable, which is a good thing when you're reading horror. That's what you want. So overall, I would say if you're not off-put by body horror, which in general is something I tend to avoid, but with Eric, I just get right into it because I know it's going to be written in such a way that I need to read it. But yeah, in general, body horror is something that I shy away from. If you're good with that, there's definitely a ton of things that could be used for content warning. I'm not going to get into it here because I wouldn't even know where to begin, but I'm sure somewhere on the internet it's listed. But if you're someone that's easily put off by horror that's a little too much, maybe avoid it. But in general, if you're all in and you've got nothing to worry about, I suggest wholeheartedly to give it a go. And I know this review is very vague, but like I said, the stories, some are so short, if I told you about them, I'd be telling you the whole thing. So it's just a general review. 2 thumbs up, 5 stars, loved it. So that's pretty well going to take care of the review part here. So if you want to take off now, you can. But I wanted to share a thought with you that I had while reading this book. Now, if you've been around my channel for a while, you may have heard me mention in the past the sort of notion of always chasing that high from when you'd be a kid and you'd read horror, that sort of fear that you'd get. It hits different when you're an adult and you're reading a horror novel. It's not as scary. Especially if you read a lot of them. I guess you kind of build, a tolerance to them. But then today when I was reading Eric's book, which, like I mentioned in the review, has a lot of things that I would normally not read, but for him, I was reading them, and I was finding myself getting really scared. Almost that kind of feeling from when you're a kid and you're reading horror. So I had this feeling, this thought. I was like, maybe it's because as we grow into adults, we know what kind of horror we like. Like for me, I love ghost stories. I love haunted houses. I love ghost stories. Any type of supernatural sort of horror that really does it for me. And it spooks me, but it doesn't get me. It doesn't truly, or at least it rarely, truly scares me in that kind of way that you would get scared when you were a kid. And maybe it's because we're curating our horror tastes too much. Maybe when we branch out, because you're a kid, you go to the library, you're just pulling horror books off them. Christopher Pike and Errol Stein, you're taking them home and you're reading them, whatever the subject matter. And today reading The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, I had that same sort of feeling because I wasn't reading the horror that I love. I was reading the horror that I didn't want to read because I wanted to read the author's words. Does that make sense? In my head, it makes sense. So maybe the key to harnessing that sort of fear we had when we were a kid is to read the kind of horror that we wouldn't normally read. Maybe not, who knows. Not always. Monster stories, aliens, that stuff doesn't scare me, but body horror does, and I avoid it because I don't like the way it makes me feel. But maybe what it makes me feel is where that fear is hidden. Reading haunted house stories and ghost stories, I love them, so that fear isn't hidden in there. And you might be listening to me and you're like, yeah, girl, I know. Well, it just came to me. So I thought I'd share it with you in case maybe you hadn't thought of that. And maybe that's your sign to sort of reach out of the horror you normally read. Read something you're kind of slightly off-put by an author you like, and see where it takes you. I loved where it took me today. Anyway, you guys, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read this or any other Eric LaRocca stories. What was your favorite? I would love to know. And subscribe if you haven't already. That helps me a ton. And I will see you guys again real soon. Bye.